My grandfather saw something in the Swiss Alps during World War II. I'm terrified to this day. Research and edits by The Facts and Fiction. Night Drive footage generously provided by Jade Widow Drives. Hey, how are you? It's really good to see you again. Buckle up and let's get going. I've got some more cool I want to show you. Alright, let's do this. And good to see you again. It's spooky season, and I've been thinking a lot about the type of stories I want to tell you in such an awesome time of the year. Obviously, I'm a big fan of cryptids, urban legends, and the paranormal, or, well, I wouldn't be doing these night drives in the first place. That said, portraying these stories and legends accurately is also really important to me. I've never been a big fan of the clickbait-style stories you can see on YouTube or wherever, where any spooky noise in the forest is a skinwalker and every weird-looking deer is a Wendigo. Don't get me wrong, I think it's really interesting to see how stories evolve and grow throughout a society, but what I don't like seeing is legends or myths deeply rooted in long-standing, often indigenous cultural ethos, more or less cannibalized for the entertainment of a broader Western audience. In a way, it always seems, off-putting to see something with potentially thousands of years of cultural, spiritual, or even religious significance reduced down to a cheesy jump scare of some guy in a morph suit jumping out from behind a tree for views on TikTok. That said, I think the original, soul of these beliefs and stories are things that deserve to be remembered. So tonight, I've got a story I found that's really fascinating for a number of reasons. I don't want to spoil too much, but part of why I think it's so fascinating is that it's almost a perfect depiction of the true heart and soul of an entity that's very misunderstood in modern spooky culture. To me, it's almost got the vibe of someone claiming they found a lost piece of Mozart's work, and it being so authentic to his style that even if it wasn't an authentic piece by Mozart, it's still valuable in its own right and can even tell us a little bit about how we humans interact with this crazy world around us. I'm not going to tell you the name of this cryptid until after the story. I want to see if you can guess it. But when I'm done, I'll tell you a bit of why I think this story is so compelling in its core nuts and bolts, and even explore a bit of why it may or may not be a true story. Last thing before we begin, I have a few caveats. First, I want to say I do have some reservations about the details of this story. We'll get into that, like I said. Second, I want to be upfront that, not for any lack of trying, I've been unable to contact the original person who reported this story. They haven't been active on Reddit, Instagram, or Twitter in years, and I can't find any other accounts that might be linked to them. So it's a bit of a ghost. That does present a few problems, as I generally like to work closely with the first-person witnesses of these stories, get clarification, additional details, and that type of thing. All in all, it's important to me to make sure I'm staying authentic to their experience while still providing an extra value to just telling you about a story I found on the internet. That simply won't be possible with this one, though I've tried to substitute my normal collaboration with the eyewitness, instead with a bit of research on the topic that should hopefully still give us a pretty unique look on their story. Also, for the sake of convenience, I'm just going to name the original author Carl from here out, though I have no idea what their real name is. With all that said, I'm going to tell you Carl's full story, or rather, Carl's grandfather's story, as Carl originally told it, with just a few minor tweaks from my notes to help it flow. Then we'll break it down and talk about what questions I would have asked if I could, and the research I did to try and answer these questions anyway. So make sure you're buckled up and feel free to turn the heat on. And let me tell you about which North American cryptid just may have been stalking the Swiss Alps. Hey, I'm Carl, and the following is a story my grandpa used to tell me before he passed away. And I thought you might be able to appreciate it. As a disclaimer, I'm not a World War II buff, and I'm just telling this story the way I remember hearing it, so some dates or locations may be slightly off. My grandfather was a British infantryman in the Second World War. He was only around 19 years old when he enlisted to serve his country, and while he thought that joining the military would give him opportunities to see exotic locations around the world, he was never deployed to Tunisia or Italy or the Pacific. Instead, he ended up practically in his own backyard, Switzerland. This is just some historical information, but it's important to understand before hearing the rest of the story. Switzerland did its best to maintain neutral status throughout the war, but regardless of its attempts to maintain neutrality, Switzerland was still highly sought after by both the Allied and the Axis powers. Once the Nazis began committing acts of aggression against Switzerland, England provided reinforcements to the Swiss military. Yet, in an effort to prevent open war within its borders, the Swiss government instructed its military and subsequently the British reinforcements to perform a series of tactical retreats into the Alps. That's how my grandpa found himself stationed in a remote village in the Swiss Alps. At this time, it was the early winter of 1943, and my grandpa's company was stationed in a secluded village of about 500 people. Part of the advantage that they had with this location was that it was really hard to get to, and therefore they had little chance of being spontaneously invaded by Nazi Germany. But this also was a disadvantage because it made communication with the rest of the Swiss military very difficult. The issue with communication was further compounded when, sometime in early December, a series of blizzards swept through the region and completely destroyed the few lines of communication that they had in the first place. So essentially trapped in this isolated Swiss village without being able to make contact with the rest of the army, my grandpa's captain decided it would be best to uphold the standing orders and continue defending the village. Weeks passed. Any roads to the outside world were buried in 7 to 9 feet of dense snowfall, and any telegraph or phone lines that they had were equally useless. It grew deeper into the winter, the leaves were stripped from the trees, and the bare trunks protruded from the mountainside like broken ribs. The town was nestled between 2 large mountains, sunlight only directly reaching the town for a few hours each day, making the soldiers feel as if they were living in a state of perpetual dusk. One night, my grandpa was at the town bar with a few of his friends from the company, and a group of locals approached them. One of them in particular was visibly upset. All of the Swiss people in the town grew up speaking German, and none of them were used to having Brits around. So one of them began shouting in broken English, "Where take you the children?" Luckily, one of the guys my grandpa was drinking with spoke fluent German, and was able to act as an impromptu translator. After several minutes of confusion and yelling, the translator turned to my grandpa and the rest of the soldiers and said, "They say some of the village children have gone missing. They want us to do something about it." Now, obviously, the British military doesn't exactly act as a bunch of mercenaries for hire, so my grandpa and his friends told the villagers to come back to the headquarters. Really, it was just a makeshift barracks that they had thrown together in the town's church, and talk to the captain. Due to the language barrier, the villagers' discussion with the captain took about 2 hours, and basically what the captain and his self-designated translator were able to piece together was that a few weeks after the company had entered the village, the locals had noticed a variety of bizarre incidents. At first, it was just benign stuff. like vanishing pieces of wood and tarp from people's sheds. But over the following 2 months, people realized that valuable items were being stolen from their homes. One man claimed that his family heirloom, a handmade ceremonial halberd, sort of like a traditional Swiss war axe, had disappeared from above his fireplace mantel. The culmination of all of these incidents was when a village child went missing. Of course, many assumed that the child's disappearance, although tragic and disconcerting, could be attributed to something as simple as the boy falling into a snowdrift while playing outside, or possibly being attacked and killed by a wolf or other predatory animal. But there wasn't only one child that disappeared. There were several. The villager who entered the bar, who looked especially upset, that was the father of 2 young boys who had gone missing just a few days prior. He had searched everywhere for them, even rounded up a posse of his fellow townspeople to join the effort, but they couldn't find a single clue as to what had happened to the children. The captain told the villagers that he would continue to look into the matter and that he would begin sending some of his men to patrol the streets each night looking for whoever or whatever was the culprit behind all these strange thefts and abductions. Later that night, Private Reginald disappeared from the barracks. Disappearing children was one thing, but a grown man? It seemed unlikely that an animal, even a wolf, could have taken down a healthy, full-grown man on its own, let alone a trained soldier. Naturally, rumors began to surface that there was some sort of monster living in the mountains that came down at night to feast on the occupants of the village. Despite the nightly patrols ordered by the captain, the disappearances kept occurring. Reginald was the only adult victim of whatever was preying on the village. The rest of the victims were all young kids between the ages of 5 and 10. All in all, including the original 3 kids who had gone missing, 7 children vanished from the town. Many people in my grandpa's company were growing suspicious. One explanation that got passed around was that the impoverished villagers were actually selling their own children to human traffickers for extra cash. But even that didn't make sense because the roads into and out of the town were still blocked by snow. 3 more weeks passed without incident. At this point, it was early spring and the snow was starting to thaw. That night, coincidentally, when my grandpa was on patrol with several other soldiers, they discovered what was behind the children's and Reginald's disappearances. It was sometime past midnight when my grandpa and his comrades noticed a figure peering through the bedroom window of one of the villagers' houses. My grandpa was at the opposite end of the street, so at first the figure looking through the window didn't see the patrol. My grandpa and the other soldiers yelled at the prowler, and it immediately tore itself from the window and began running away. Everyone in the patrol was certain this was what was behind the disappearances and break-ins. They ran as fast as they could in pursuit, through the melting snow and ice in the dead of night, screaming at whatever it was to stop. They kept running and soon found themselves on the outskirts of the village, where the snow was still fairly deep. The figure, quote, jumped into the ground. It looked like it had vanished into thin air at first, but as the patrol grew closer, they realized that the prowler had actually just jumped into a cave that had been hollowed out in the side of a snowdrift. Just as the soldiers began yelling into the cave for the figure to come out and show itself, several gunshots exploded out of the entrance to the snow cave. Without thinking, my grandpa and the rest of the patrol shouldered their weapons and all began firing into the hole. Silence. They waited for what seemed like hours, but was really just a couple of minutes. One incredibly brave member of the patrol volunteered to climb into the cave and investigate. He drew his pistol, kneeled down, and crawled into the cave. Several seconds later, he emerged with a completely horrified expression on his face. My grandpa took out his flashlight and shined it into the cave when he saw the gruesome explanation behind the strange encounters in the town. The figure that they had been chasing was Reginald, the private who had gone missing weeks before. They had shot Reginald right through the heart. The cave was not only occupied by Reginald, however, as there surrounding him, my grandfather's squad found the partially eaten bodies of 7 children and a halberd. Either due to the stress of being snowed in all winter, living in near constant darkness, or some sort of terrible mental issue, Reginald had gone completely insane and had begun breaking into the villagers' houses, snatching their children from their homes in the middle of the night. After this, he would apparently slit their throats and use the halberd that had been reported missing to dismember the bodies, all while hidden in the cave he had carved into the snowdrift. So, quite the story. The first thing that came to my mind after finishing this story, well, after the initial unsettled shock at the conclusion, was actually a moderate level of skepticism. Sure, the story felt well written, interesting and unique, just enough detail to string you along, but not enough to turn reading into a chore. But I obviously wanted to know if it could possibly be true, so I reached out to the person who wrote the story, and after several days of not hearing anything online, I stalked them on social media. Despite being quite active online on a few different platforms, the last thing I can find that they posted anywhere was in 2018. Hopefully they're alive and well and simply have cut ties with one of their online handles. I certainly can relate if that's the case. But like I mentioned when I picked you up for our drive, this made fact-checking a good bit more difficult. But I also thought it would be a good opportunity to cover a story more as a researcher than a reporter. In the past, I've conducted interviews with the various eyewitnesses and have tried to put together a big picture of what happened before having them review my notes for accuracy. This time, I spent, an easy 60, 70 hours researching this topic, contacting native German speakers and linguists, studying old World War II training manuals for winter warfare, and reaching out to World War II historians to try and really zero in on what may or may not have happened here. So hopefully you're comfortable and are enjoying this so far because, well, I've put a lot of work into it and I hope you find it all as interesting as I have. Anyway, let me summarize the 3 big issues I had with this story, and then I'll tell you about what I learned as I researched them. To be clear, I was approaching this from the standpoint of trying to debunk the story based on the quote-unquote weakest aspects, at least as they struck me when I first read it. So, first and foremost, Switzerland was famously neutral in World War II. So much so that growing up, if 2 kids in school were arguing about something and tried to drag you into it, you could simply throw your hands up and say, "Oh no, I'm Switzerland." And everyone would know exactly what you meant. Leave me out of your fight, I'm just doing my thing over here. So that immediately warrants a bit of scrutiny on the story's claim that British soldiers were formally deployed to Switzerland. If there were never British troops in Switzerland in World War II, this story falls apart pretty much instantly. Full stop. Second is the issue of, well, snow. At risk of sounding awfully stupid, it snows a lot in Switzerland. And even shallow snow leaves extremely obvious footprints that any child could follow, let alone grown adults with experience hunting and tracking animals through the winter months. How is it that no one could simply have followed Private Reginald's footprints from, say, a child's home to his hideout in the snow cave? And last, but Well, actually, no, this one is definitely the least in terms of its overall impact on the story, but I had a question about German grammar. I wanted to know about the single phrase we got in broken English from the villager. Where take you the children? It may sound like just a broken but basically intelligible sentence, but it actually is a pretty specific sentence structure. When people speak only a small amount of another language, they'll generally take the few words they know, but they'll actually use the sentence structure of their own mother tongue. So if a native German speaker would never structure a question like, where take you the children, maybe they'd say, children take where you instead. That might tell us something. Admittedly, again, it wouldn't tell us much because it would be now a fourth-hand analysis of a single sentence spoken over 80 years ago in a high-intensity situation. Still, though, for whatever reason, it struck me as something that I could look into, so I did. With that out of the way, let's take a look at by far the most important question in regards to the story. Did Britain ever put boots on Swiss soil in World War II? As I mentioned, I did a lot of research on these questions, but this question, being by far the most important, I also spent the vast majority of my research time looking into this specifically. The short answer to the question is no. They absolutely, unequivocally, never deployed infantry to Switzerland in World War II. Things like troop movements and deployments are extensively documented, and there simply are no units that were ever deployed there. Period. Full stop. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. But the long answer is much more interesting, and it has to do with spies and special forces and secret missions and political espionage and honestly all the stuff that would make an excellent movie. You see, Britain never formally deployed troops to Switzerland. We know that, it's well documented. But at the beginning of the war, Britain did guarantee Swiss independence and neutrality, which is essentially the official way of saying, hey, if Germany or Italy or Japan, I guess, invades you, we'll reinforce you with our own troops to ensure you remain independent. It's sort of like a one-way defensive alliance that a stronger power will offer to a weaker power to discourage their neighbors from getting too handsy. And that's all well and good, but it also stayed entirely a political formality. I mean, you might also say it worked as, and I know this might be surprising, but Japan never ended up invading Switzerland. Or, either of the others. And while this is exactly what the British High Command wanted, short of Switzerland joining the Allies in the war, it also meant that Great Britain never had a good reason to deploy their desperately needed troops to a war zone that didn't exist yet. And as we know, never would. When we also consider that by the summer of 1940, Britain had evacuated as many British and French troops from the continent as they possibly could, not only would deploying reinforcements to Switzerland be beyond comical, there's no way Britain could continue supplying them logistically. So at this point, I had a few thoughts. First was perhaps Karl simply got the dates wrong. You see, if their grandfather had said 1940 instead of 1943, that actually could be feasible, maybe. Britain had deployed the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, to France in the lead-up to World War II, anticipating the war that was on the horizon. Some of these British troops even ended up serving in the French Alps, in battles like the Battle of Little St. Bernard Pass, which was only a few miles from the Swiss border. It's not entirely impossible that his grandfather joined the British Expeditionary Force and was fighting in, quote, the Alps near the Swiss border, and Karl simply misheard or misremembered the details and left us with Switzerland, Alps, 1943. One big issue with this is that Italy, who the French were fighting in the Second Battle of the Alps, invaded France in June of 1940, as in summer, not winter. When I found this, I pretty much was ready to stick a fork in this hypothesis and say, oh no, there's no way. But then I found that, amazingly, the Italian invasion of France, often referred to as the Second Battle of the Alps, was famously heavily impeded by multiple enormous snowstorms. We're talking there was so much snow this June and July, it completely closed off mountain passes, blocked roads, obliterated anything close to supply lines, and to add insult to injury, the battle was widely considered a decisive French victory due to their extensive use of specialist mountain ski troops. So yeah, you literally had French ski commandos doing circles around the Italians, planting explosives, triggering avalanches on them. I mean, the whole thing was honestly wild. So, bizarrely, the misremembered or misunderstood hypothesis was back on the table as technically maybe possible, but still very unlikely, as it would mean that the author had misremembered the year, the time of year, the country, and pretty much all of the major supporting details for the story. But learning about French special forces here actually got me thinking. What if his grandfather was a specialized mountain trooper as well? So I started to dig deeper into British special forces during the war, and at first I was really excited as I found quite a bit of information about the British Special Operations Executive, or SOE, operating throughout Europe, yes, but specifically in Switzerland as well. This immediately left me wondering why all of the sources were so clear, though, that Britain did not deploy ground troops at all if they had the SOE operating in Switzerland, as more or less of an open secret. Everyone at the time knew that this was happening, and yet no one, even now, was saying that it was. So, for a bit of background on the SOE and what I learned about it, Winston Churchill ordered the creation of the SOE 3 days after the Italians invaded France, and it was basically the merger of 3 different, essentially spy agencies. 2 were civilian and 1 was military, and you could almost think of it like if the US president ordered the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, and Special Operations Command to all merge together into a single military-run spy and special forces group for the duration of the war. I guess it's honestly not the worst idea, as it would essentially be like saying, hey, let's get Jason Bourne, SEAL Team 6, and the Area 51 guys together and let them cook. The big hang-up with this, though, is that the more I learned about the SOE's involvement in Switzerland, the more I learned that its involvement was entirely clandestine. Essentially, they had spies there before the war, and they technically now reported to and were part of the military, but they were essentially still just spies with the extra task of helping organize potential resistance movements in Switzerland, so they were ready in case Germany invaded and the Swiss government fell. So as exciting as it was to find all of this, it in no way resembled the timing or type of deployment that Carl described. And it also explained why everyone knew that the SOE was involved in Switzerland throughout the war, but everyone was also maintaining that they never really sent troops there. I figured this would probably be the end of it, but wanted to make sure I covered my bases, so I dug deep to really try and exhaust every angle I could and try and find any evidence that the SOE deployed any of their actual special forces operators as opposed to spies. Going into this, I found a couple of interesting things. I had found a general lead that confirmed the SOE would attach its special forces units to spies for specific missions, but nothing at all that said this happened in Switzerland itself. So it was possible, but still not confirmed. I also found that the very first director of the SOE was literally the British ambassador to Switzerland and a spy master there up until his appointment. So in short, I knew there was a ton of spy stuff going on in Switzerland, but I needed to find SEAL Team 6, not Jason Bourne, even if technically they reported to the same boss way up the food chain. And there was nothing. So, after exhausting all the leads I could think of, I finally decided my last box to check would be the history of British intelligence in Switzerland, but on a very high level, like what was the relationship like between the SOE and Switzerland throughout the war, as opposed to can I find documentation of any specific troop movements on the ground level. And that's when I found it. Buried in an obscure journal of British military history, I found the smoking gun. You see, Carl was very correct that Britain and all the Allied and Axis powers wanted Switzerland on their side. Not only did they control two of the most important tunnels through the Alps, connecting the north half of Europe to the Mediterranean, but they had the benefit of extraordinarily defensible terrain located dead in the heart of Europe, and enormous financial reserves for virtually every government involved in the conflict. This was so significant that there was actually pretty intense internal disagreement in the SOE as to how they should try and sway Switzerland, or whether they should simply use it as an asset. Multiple high-ranking agency members wanted to capitalize on Switzerland's strategic position, and basically use it as a staging ground for their special forces operations. With easy access to the relatively undefended industrial centers around Munich and Augsburg, it was a really tempting proposition for a lot of them. Ultimately, however, the High Command felt it was too risky to violate Swiss neutrality and potentially drive them toward siding with the Axis. So, while there were multiple members of the SOE who wanted to override Swiss interests in pursuit of Britain's military objectives, these members were largely reined in. Except for, quote, a brief period in late 1943. I don't think I need to tell you how shocked and excited and unsettled I was when I found this. There in front of me was the confirmation I was almost certain at this point didn't exist. There was exactly one time in all of World War II when Great Britain did in fact deploy special forces agents to Switzerland, and it was in the winter of 1943. And while this doesn't exactly match up with Carl's grandfather saying he was an infantryman in World War II, it is compatible with him saying he started as an infantryman, and even if he told Carl that he was in the infantry at the time of this story, well, he wouldn't be the first or the last if he went to his grave keeping the true nature of his role in the British Special Forces a secret. The late actor Sir Christopher Lee famously was part of the British Special Forces, and to his dying day, divulged little to no information whatsoever about the details of his service. So, with that bombshell out of the way, let's talk a little bit about Snow and German. As I mentioned before, the vast majority of my research was on, well, what we just talked about. So these two will be less researched and a little more anecdotal, but they're worth acknowledging nonetheless because, well, nothing we've talked about actually proves the story true. It just leaves the door open for it being possible, but it could still be fiction nonetheless. And maybe a closer look at some of the finer details here will help us figure that out. The story specifically mentions snow as a key factor influencing the events that took place. Now, I know not everyone has lived in places that get a lot of snow. Hell, I know several people who have never actually seen snow in their lives. And most people who do get snow generally see it in relatively smaller quantities. Think inches, not feet. And this is honestly how it works with any environment. Something like 85% of humanity lives near the coast, but only a tiny fraction of humanity actually lives on the beach. Similarly, more people live close to the mountains than in the mountains, and people get a bit of snow more often than, well, feet and feet of snow. Since I couldn't reach Carl to find out how familiar he was with snow, or his grandfather for that matter, I'm going to assume he falls in either the no snow or little snow camp, based on nothing more than that being statistically the most likely scenario. On the flip side, I happen to have lived most of my life in places that get a lot of snow. I distinctly remember waking up one morning to over 7 feet that had fallen overnight, not counting the snowdrifts, which were over 10, and it still didn't even count as a snow day. Somehow. Anyway, this may all seem a bit of an odd point to make, but I want to talk about some of the things that stood out specifically as odd to me in regards to how Carl talked about snow. So, first things first, when most people think of snow, it's going to be pretty consistent with what you see on TV. We're talking ankle deep to maybe mid-calves, and, well, it's cold, wet, kind of slippery, and the type of thing you see kids playing in without too much trouble. It's also just enough to stick on the ground without immediately melting as soon as the snowfall stops, but it's entirely manageable for most people to walk or drive in without too much practice, specialized equipment, or even four-wheel drive, really. Oh, and notably, yes, it does leave footprints, but they can very quickly be covered up with more snow or simply melt away in a minor thaw. Alright, so let's talk about deep snow. We're talking about snow that's up to your knees or higher, and the single biggest takeaway here is that once snow starts to get around the 1 foot mark, the way it behaves is virtually the opposite of shallow snow in almost every way. If you don't have four-wheel drive, you really shouldn't risk driving, and even with four-wheel drive, you would be best off with a dedicated set of snow tires as well as snow chains. Snow chains are basically like a net made out of chains that hug the outside of your tire and give you extra grip in snow. Walking is very difficult without snowshoes, and ironically, in many cases it's warmer than when there's a small amount of snow. But that has to do with some pretty complex atmospheric mechanics and isn't always the case. What's important here, though, is that even very intuitive statements like deeper snow would mean colder air can actually be misleading at best and the opposite of what's true at worst. And probably the best example of this is actually when it relates to how footprints work in deep snow. Getting the obvious out of the way, it's harder to walk through. Like, a lot harder. To get an idea, walking through deep snow is going to be harder than water, but easier than mud. And from the sheer difficulty perspective, I'd much rather walk through waist-deep water on any day than waist-deep snow. Because of this, what usually ends up happening is one person will make a path either by walking or shoveling or both, and anyone else walking in that same general direction will just follow that same path, which slightly widens and flattens it, makes it even easier to walk on, and the pattern will continue. You can actually see the same thing happening in nature if you look up a video of reindeer walking through snow, and you'll often see them moving in single file. Long story short, it's much easier to quote-unquote make a trail than for everyone to just make their own and walk wherever. And the reason I really want to paint a clear picture here is that the same reason it's easier to walk through a path carved in deep snow is the exact reason it's so much harder for footprints in deep snow to get covered up. In simple terms, not only does it take a ton of extra snow to fill in your steps, but since snow falls pretty evenly, your trail will often never be fully filled, leaving a telltale valley through the deeper sections of snow on either side of where you walked. This effect is so pronounced, someone can walk through a field at the beginning of winter, provided that there's relatively deep snow to start with, and you might not know if it was a human or an animal that walked through that area, but you will definitely know that something walked through it, even all the way up till the end of winter. And the deeper the snow was when the trail was first carved, the more likely it is that that trail will be preserved until everything melts. In short, once someone has walked through an area, the path they used will generally stay lower than the untouched areas around for the rest of winter. With all this in mind, when you hear stories about people lost during the winter and maybe search and rescue can't follow their trail, this is usually due to one of three reasons. First, the snow was relatively shallow, so light or even normal snowfall is enough to fill in the relatively shallow tracks. Second, a large enough blizzard comes in to fill in the deeper tracks regardless, which can happen. Or, the third reason is that whoever is telling the story simply isn't too familiar with snow in general and made a mistake. Though this is obviously most often the case in fiction. The general rule, though, the deeper the snow, the harder it is for someone to get truly lost, as it takes more and more extreme conditions to erase their trail. Tracking a person or animal through the snow is extremely easy. So, with all of that said, what's my conclusion on how snow factors into all of this? Well, at first I honestly thought this was a pretty heavy point against how true this story might be. A group of villagers who had spent their entire lives not only living in, but hunting and tracking during heavy snowfall would certainly be able to follow any mysterious tracks leading outside of the village, right? Well, yes, but that actually all changed right at the end of the story, and I don't think it's nearly as simple as I thought it might be at the beginning. See, a lot of us have a very romantic idea of winter being a time to cozy up by a fire and wait out the cold months until spring. And while this is certainly true in some cases, winter in rural Switzerland, even up to the time of World War II, was a different matter entirely. Due to the long, harsh winters and limited arable land, the growing season in Switzerland, specifically in the Alps, often wasn't long enough to grow enough crops to last through the winter. So the Swiss had to rely on hunting and livestock to supplement their grain supply. This often meant that there was a network of fairly well-trodden paths within the village and also leading out to various livestock paddocks, hunting grounds, granaries, or even outhouses. This would also make it reasonably possible for anyone to follow these paths without leaving any distinguishable footprints within the village or for quite a ways outside of the village. And considering the fact that the entire premise of the story is that this regiment of soldiers were completely snowed in and unable to leave, it makes sense that the deep snow would result in this network of relatively deep paths carved through the snow. But the snow trails themselves actually weren't what changed my opinion on this aspect of the story. It was actually the location Carl mentioned that Private Reginald's snow cave was made, which got me thinking. Carl describes the prowler as running to the outskirts of the village before jumping into the ground and vanishing into thin air, before the patrol approached and realized he had actually just jumped into a cave that had been hollowed out in the side of a snowdrift. Further, Carl made a point to note that they didn't chase the man off into the forest or over the river and through the woods. In fact, right where the path would naturally begin to taper off is exactly where he said this cave was located. Now, it also might sound ridiculous to have a quote-unquote hidden snow cave built directly next to a heavily trafficked path and in the side of a snowdrift. But what if I were to tell you this is actually one of the best places for one? See, I did a lot of winter camping growing up, and my friends and I liked to dig snow tunnels, caves, or build forts out of the snow and then play games in them. One of these games was the classic hide-and-go-seek, but we quickly learned that, well, it was incredibly easy to simply follow a set of footprints to a hidden fort, and the game sort of fell flat. But then one of us realized that if you built a fort in one of the snowdrifts next to the campground parking lot or along one of the major paths people had walked along, you could walk or run along the compacted snow and jump into your fort without leaving much of a trace whatsoever. I had honestly forgotten about this set of memories until researching this case, but I can't tell you how many times we would be huddled up in one of these snowdrift forts together, giggling as cars and people passed by us, sometimes within just a few feet, without the faintest clue that there was someone watching them. As far as being detected by our footsteps between the path and the snow fort entrances, we quickly learned that while it was uncommon to find redundant major paths cut through the snow for the reasons I mentioned earlier, it was actually very common to see the odd set of footprints climbing up and out of the snow trench and out of sight over the top of the snowdrift itself. Whether it was from people messing around or pushing each other into the snow, climbing up the sides to get a better look at something, or just stepping off the path to answer nature's call, no one from ground level ever bat an eye at our specific set of footprints. And, unless you actually followed our one specific set of footprints up and over the snowdrift, you'd have no reason to suspect they led to anywhere special. All in all, the principle is pretty much identical to what we see portrayed in Carl's story. Travel along the path where everyone walks so you don't leave noticeable tracks. Build your hideout just a few yards up and off the path and with the mouth of your cave facing up towards the sky. Follow your same few footsteps up and down the wall of the snowdrift, and make sure to listen to any approaching footsteps crunching through the snow before leaving to make sure you're not spotted. Now, while this is all well and good, it does speak to a very specific set of experiences, and it's not something that came naturally to us at all. We actually didn't figure this out until after a significant amount of trial and error, and we were into our teens before we put all the pieces together. So just because this type of thing is possible, it doesn't mean it's the type of thing Private Reginald would just intuitively figure out. He would either need to be from a snowbound part of the British Empire, or have received pretty specific training on the subject. This isn't necessarily a deal breaker if our assumption about Carl's grandfather is true. If he really was a member of the Special Forces, then his unit would undoubtedly have received extensive training in mountain and winter warfare, which would also include Private Reginald. And while I easily imagine these lessons would include how to travel and hide out in snowbound areas, all while leaving as little evidence of your passage as possible, you know what they say about assumptions. So, I rolled up my sleeves and decided to dive into the history of British winter warfare training in World War II. If it turned out that Britain didn't really train troops in winter warfare tactics, well, that could be a reasonable point against all of this being true. And what I found? Well, in short, yes. Britain began training both standard and special forces operators in winter warfare tactics starting in 1940, and continued to do so throughout the war. By 1943, they had 3 years of experience in training for, conducting, and improving their winter operations and training regimen, and they had it down to a very well-oiled machine. They specifically worked quite close with the Norwegians and even Icelanders, another interesting case of Britain's relationship with a quote-unquote neutral country during the war. But where this got particularly interesting to me was when I found a 1941 training standards document, basically a document for British High Command summarizing what one of these winter training programs entailed, as well as the core competencies graduating soldiers would have, and an outline for the types of operations they would be qualified for. This document stated there would be 4 general categories of qualification to graduate, each summarizing the most important aspects of surviving, navigating, and fighting in a winter environment. And what was one of these qualification categories? Well, understanding the importance of transitioning, quote, from a road to a roadless country within the context of a snowy or mountainous environment. That is to say, not only did I find rather extensive documentation that British Special Forces were heavily trained in mountain and snowbound warfare by 1943, but that documentation specifically highlighted that one of the most important factors of an Alpine Commando's toolkit would be navigating between road and off-road environments, including specific training on when and where to set up observation posts and firing posts, and how to keep these quote-unquote snow caves or snow trenches both well hidden from view and still within easy access to navigable paths. I'll be honest, I didn't expect to find anything close to a direct hit like this. To reiterate, training documentation on how Special Forces units should transition between a road and roadless country in the winter, and how to establish observation positions in man-made, well-camouflaged snow caves overlooking paths, towns, roads, and other locations of interest. Well, let's just say that this was now the second time I'd started off pretty skeptical about part of the story, only to find it not only possible in this case, but verified. So beyond all odds, we are now 2 for 2 on this story being at least possible. And given how insanely specific and obscure some of these things had to be, well, I don't know if I can say it's likely true, but it certainly adds a level of credibility that I never expected at the beginning. That said, let's jump into the final piece I looked into, the part about the German language. As I mentioned previously, we only get one line of the broken English from a German speaker, and our only account is from a second-hand source, told about events from over 80 years ago. Like every point here, I really want to reiterate that this is not a lot to go on. In fact, of everything we've looked at so far, this is by far the least significant in helping us zero in on the truth of this story. That said, the phrase, "where take you the children," is very specific. You've got the location, where, the verb, take, and the person acting, you, all followed by the thing that they've taken, the children. In English, we would say, "where did you take the children?" Location, actor, action, recipient. And this is more or less the same as how we would do it in Spanish. "Donde tuvieron los niños?" Location, actor / action combined, and the recipient. In Japanese, you're looking at "kodomo tachi wa doko ni motekimashita," or "children, where did you bring?" Recipient, location, actor, action. The important thing to note here is that each language has a very specific order for structuring these things, and I wanted to know how it would be done in German. So I reached out to several of my German friends I've made over the years, and while I was waiting to hear back from them, I gave it all a crack with ye olde Google Translate. Some of the things which stood out to me off the bat were, well, they weren't promising. First of all, the word taken is mitgenommen, whereas bring would be bringen. People like cognates, 2 words which sound the same and mean essentially the same thing, but in 2 different languages. So, why not say in English, bring the children, where bring you the children, since bring in English would be closer to the German bringen. Honestly, it's probably as simple as because the word take is more commonly used than bring, so you might learn it before bring, even if bring and bringen are cognates. But still, perhaps, this was a slight point against this part of the story. I then decided to take a look at Swiss German, as it is subtly but still notably distinct from Low German, or the German that you're probably thinking of. What I found was, when it comes to Swiss German, they don't have the simple past tense. That's the language nerd of saying words like took, ate, broke, fell, or ran. These don't exist in Swiss German. Instead of saying, I took the apple, you would say, I have taken the apple. Or I ran to the store would be, I have run to the store, and so on. This was potentially even a larger point against this phrase, as take is, well, that type of word that doesn't exist in Swiss German. It should have been have taken, or at least where taken you the children. Again, I was more than ready to say that this was something simply lost in 80 years of translation, literally, but I was more or less prepared to set this as a point against the story, weak as it might be. Then my German friends got back to me, and the first thing that each of them said, independently of the others, well, it's a bit odd because taking the dog's kids or object isn't really a thing that we would say. We would say have taken, or where are you taking the children? Okay, actually perfectly in line with what I'd found about Swiss German. But if this was the same between Swiss German and Low German, why did the language sites I'd found explicitly point it out as a difference? I explained a bit about the story I was looking at and gave them a bit more context, and then they explained something that helped it all fit together, at least in my mind. They said that grammatically, when translated word for word into English, High German and Swiss German are actually very close to Middle or Shakespearean English. Obviously, most of the time when it's translated into modern English, but if we're actually looking for the direct translation, it comes out like something we might hear from a Shakespearean play. And the difference between the types of words that do or don't exist in different types of German are very subtle to us. For example, where we might hear someone say, "Where hast thou brought the children?" or "Where taketh ye the children?" and first laugh at how old and funny it sounds, we would still understand that both questions are asking the exact same thing. However, when it comes to Swiss versus Low German understands both but only uses one. Swiss German exclusively has and uses the other, and this is the core of what those language sites were getting at. But I'm not going to bore you here with a grammar lesson on Swiss German and linguistic history. Instead, I'm going to translate the question, "Where did you take the children?" into Middle English here, and I think you're going to instantly see the point I'm getting at. In High German, it would be, "Whither hast thou taken the children?" "Wohin hast du die Kinder mitgenommen?" The true Swiss German translation of this question into English is, "Wohin bringest du die Kinder?" "Where taketh ye the children?" Or, "Where take you the children?" I don't think I need to really point out how stunned I was when I first pieced this all together. But that single, otherwise throwaway line of German to English actually has the exact sentence structure as it would be translated word for word, not just from general German, but from Swiss German. Most people don't even know that there are multiple types of German. If anything, going into this with just light familiarity on the topic would actually position you to fall into a trap and phrase things the Low German way, without knowing it was completely incompatible with Swiss German. In short, if someone were trying to fabricate this, they either have rather extensive training in speaking Swiss German specifically, paid an extreme amount of attention to these 5 words, researched them to a level that I did, all to win a few credibility points for a Reddit post no one would ever likely microanalyze to the point that I ultimately did. Or despite all of the odds, this may actually be an authentic linguistic fingerprint preserved across those 80 years of history, and from his grandfather to his grandchild to us. No matter the case, whether this is a fabrication or not, I'm immensely impressed and surprised that this tiny little rabbit hole turned into anything, let alone something that, once again, actually seems to lend a reasonable amount of possibility to this story's authenticity. Honestly, I guess this entire story so far has been case after case of this exact sort of thing. I thought there weren't any British troops in Switzerland in World War II, until I found they were not only there, they were only there in the narrow window of time that Carl's grandfather said they were. I thought the descriptions of how snow played into the story sounded a bit clumsy, like the way someone might describe how people interact with snow if they had never experienced it themselves. Until I learned they perfectly matched the winter warfare tactics and training of those British soldiers who definitely certainly never ever were in Switzerland. And last but not least, I thought the clumsy translation of "Where take you the children" would be at the very least grammatically incorrect when translated from Swiss German, until I spoke with some native German speakers and learned that the literal way a Swiss German speaker would say it is "Where taketh ye the children." So, we've covered the story, and despite all, and I do mean all the odds, we've shockingly established that everything from the dates and places to minor linguistic details actually do line up perfectly and exclusively when and where Carl's grandfather said they did. I'll mention one final time. This is not proof that the story is true. I didn't find a death record for a Private Reginald of the British Mountaineering Special Operations Regiment, February 12, 1944, during a friendly fire incident, Schugen, Switzerland. That would be proof. But I've spent several weeks trying to find a single deal breaker to debunk this story. I've even contacted a World War II historian who said that he couldn't technically find a deal breaker with it either. And, well, so far, while it isn't proven, it amazingly checks out. And it damn well may be true. When you first got into the car, I told you I wasn't going to reveal the name of the mythological creature this story is connected to. I also mentioned that covering myths and creatures of legend accurately is incredibly important to me. So much so that I honestly skip probably 90% of the stories I research or read while I prep for these drives, because, well, so many of them are junk. Or, if not junk, then at least obvious fiction. Now, considering we've spent the entire drive so far exploring the historical accuracy, or possibility of this case, you're probably wondering why the thing that got me so interested in this story isn't the historical aspect at all. So, without further ado, and hopefully saving the best for last, let's talk about Private Reginald and why I feel this case tracks with near perfect accuracy to the traditional, authentic accounts of the Wendigo. So, what is a Wendigo? Or more accurately, let's talk about what a Wendigo isn't. See, before we get into the heart, pun intended, of what makes a Wendigo, we really have to address the rotting, lanky, deer-headed monster in the room. I don't know how much you've heard of Wendigos in pop culture, but if you've heard or seen anything about them, you probably have a mental image of a tall, upright monster with skeletal figures and rotting flesh, and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Most importantly, however, the iconic hollow deer skull for a head, crowned with a formidable set of antlers. The deer zombie aesthetic is so pervasive with the Wendigo, in fact, you might be surprised to learn that there are virtually zero confirmed original accounts where this creature is ever described as having the head of a deer. And by original, I'm referring to the legends and stories from the greater Anishinaabe peoples, groups such as the Algonquin and Ojibwe, and the peoples from which the Wendigo story originally comes from. And while I'm personally a big fan of the zombie deer aesthetic, it's much more descriptive of various Slavic monsters, such as the Leshy, a giant forest god often depicted as a humanoid with horns or antlers, not unlike the Gallo-Celtic god of Cernunnos, the lord of forests, beasts, and wild places. Though it does bear mentioning that neither of these entities are often depicted with the full head of a deer, more so something like a faun or half-human, half-beast representation of man's forgotten or discarded origins in nature. The deer-headed Wendigo you are familiar with, from what I can tell, dates back to a 1944 illustration by Matthew Fox in a book called Famous Fantastic Mysteries. This compilation contained a story appropriately titled The Wendigo, in which this portrayal was featured, though it bears mentioning that while this creature was covered in hair and did have a large set of antlers, the face itself was decidedly human-like. Further, many of the stories or themes within the book vary from insensitive to outright racist, and it's far from a reliable source on some of the Amerindian stories it draws inspiration from. This aesthetic, however, was most famously popularized in the 1989 film adaptation of Stephen King's Pet Sematary, and is the first version of the creature I can find that fully captures the deer zombie look as we know it today. This portrayal of the Wendigo was so iconic, however, that it was reiterated in multiple comic books, TV shows, and video games throughout the 2000s, even making an appearance in a companion guide to Pathfinder, a tabletop game based on the famous Dungeons & Dragons. With all that said, there are deer-headed monsters depicted within some Native American cultures. The deer man most appropriately comes to mind here, and there even are some who argue that the Wendigo is from Native American folklore, deer-headed monsters are from Native American folklore. Who's to say they didn't merge together at some point? I want to address that specifically as problematic for a few reasons. First, it assumes a Native American monoculture. Basically that all Amerindian people were the same, and, well, hopefully I don't have to point out how that's false. The second issue is it assumes a lot about the roles these entities played within various Amerindian societies. Maybe a good way to explain it would be if an alien showed up to you and told you that Spider-Man and Harry Potter are both fictional, so you must believe all wizards have spider powers and Spider-Man had a magic wand. This would obviously seem pretty ridiculous. Now, bear with me, but what if I took the example a step further, and instead that same alien said, Spider-Man and Jesus are both fictional characters, so Jesus was slinging webs and fighting crime on the streets of Jerusalem, and Spider-Man could walk on water. I don't think I need to point out how that could be extremely offensive to some, and even for those who aren't Christian, someone honestly making that assertion would seem out of touch, to put it very kindly. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that the Algonquin peoples held the Wendigo in the same regard that Christians hold Jesus. But I am saying that it really doesn't help us get anywhere, at least not anywhere good or useful, if we simply take these stories and say, I wasn't raised with this entity as part of my beliefs, so I'm going to assume that the Algonquins view the Wendigo the same way I do Harry Potter. At best, this just leaves us as an out-of-touch alien who thinks Harry Potter and Spider-Man are interchangeable. At worst, we run the risk of conflating comic books with religious beliefs. Most likely, we'll end up somewhere in the middle, and in either case, we'll just be wrong about the entire thing. The third issue here is that it implies that any story that seems fictional entertainment to us also served the same role to the culture from which the tale originates. Keep in mind, we don't have to think something is literally true to believe it's valuable. We find meaning in stories and fiction and fantasy all the time, or we wouldn't even bother creating it. We find value in the tale of the Emperor's clothes because we see the vanity and political dogmatism it critiques play out in work and school and society every day. In Germany, nearly half the population are either atheist or irreligious, and many more consider Christianity more of a tradition than a true belief. And yet, throughout the country, Christmas remains one of the most popular holidays. At the end of the day, holding two things as fiction really doesn't give us license to conclude they hold the same emotional, cultural, or personal significance within the cultures that share them. To tie a bow on all of this, it's really easy to take stories or beliefs from a culture we're unfamiliar with, and then merge them all together into one giant blob. It's similarly easy for us to take any of these stories and callously lump them into the category of fantastical fiction. And that can very quickly run us into problems if our goal is to understand the role these stories played within their original society, at least with any level of accuracy. It may sound completely ridiculous for an alien to assume that Spider-Man and Jesus occupy the same role in our culture, but if we aren't extremely careful, it's very, very easy for us to do the exact same thing, but with other people. And that's something I really want to avoid while investigating this topic. Actually, as an aside, this whole dynamic is also the reason I haven't delved into popular cryptids like the Skinwalker from the Dene or Navajo culture. It may happen in the future, but that type of spooky drive will be fairly well spaced out, due to the amount of research I feel is necessary to address these topics accurately. But to answer the question, no. I don't think that just because the Deer Man belongs to one Amerindian culture, and the Wendigo belongs to another Amerindian culture, that the deer zombie Wendigo with antlers hybrid is authentic or accurate or even really arguable. Hansel and Gretel didn't enter the witch's gingerbread hut to find Tom Bombadil and the Count of Monte Cristo sharing a cup of tea with the Mad Hatter. I think you get what I'm saying. Alright, we've wrapped up what the Wendigo is not. Now, to tie this all together and get you home at a somewhat decent hour, let's talk about what a Wendigo is and why this story has grown to bother me. The true Wendigo stems from the Amerindian peoples who inhabited the region stretching from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast. Think Michigan, Ontario, Maine, and Newfoundland. Specifically, it comes from the Anishinaabe peoples, though you may be more familiar with some of the regional groups, such as the Algonquin and Ojibwe. And in short, these people describe it in a strikingly uniform manner. Physically, a Wendigo is a supernaturally strong, lightning-fast, skeletal, human-like being, which can range from the size of a child to something of truly titanic proportions. Additionally, its body is often frozen or even made of ice, and it's heavily associated with ice, winter, starvation, scarcity, war, essentially any time where life isn't easy. As far as behavior is concerned, it is considered evil and ravenous, but perhaps most importantly of all, the Wendigo is considered human. or at least partially. You see, a Wendigo isn't actually a creature per se, living, undead, or otherwise. On the contrary, a Wendigo is an evil spirit which has possessed a human, both corrupting their body and driving them to acts of extreme evil and cultural taboo. In this case, and most famously, the cultural taboo of cannibalism. And while I should note there are examples of spirits interacting with animals in Anishinaabe culture, not only am I completely unaware of the Wendigo spirit possessing an animal, I am almost certain the Wendigo is described as being explicitly incapable of possessing an animal. After all, this would fundamentally undermine the very human taboos the Wendigo represents. And this makes sense to me too. If the Wendigo represents the evils that can occur when a human gives in to the extremes of greed, gluttony, or cannibalism, well, then tales of a bear or a wolf or even a deer attacking and killing a human, those would describe a threat, but would seem rather useless to caution humans away from cannibalism. At the end of the day, this is relatively standard wildlife behavior, and the Wendigo represents a very human set of cultural ideals and taboos. I'm honestly not sure on the story around the first Wendigo, or if there even is a first. But the Wendigo spirit is characterized by its unbelievable hunger, stalking winter-stricken villages, hunters, families, anyone hungry and concerned for their survival in the bitter winters of the Great White North. Some tales even describe it as holding winter in its frozen heart, either making winters more ferocious, driving away game, freezing summer crops with late frosts, or souring food supplies in an attempt to exacerbate the people's hunger. Meanwhile, as the people would grow hungrier, it would whisper to the starving and the worried, gently rationalizing to them the need to indulge in cannibalism. The next steps are rather simple, albeit consummately gruesome. Essentially, when someone finally gives in to these whispers, it grants the spirit of the Wendigo something of permission to possess them, freezing their heart and granting their body supernatural strength, speed, and agility, along with the overwhelming drive to overpower anyone nearby and sate their frenzied hunger. And while I'm not sure the cultural significance of this, or if it's just a selection bias in the materials I was able to find on the subject, it seems that there's a trend within these stories that seems to warn of warriors, hunters, or fathers being particularly vulnerable to the Wendigo's seduction. The curse of the Wendigo, however, isn't simply this possession. Rather, it wouldn't become clear to its host until after their first charnel meal. You see, once you had finished consuming your former friends, family, or travel companions, rather than feel satisfied, you would find yourself just as hungry, if not more so, than before you had fed. In fact, you would discover you had grown quite significantly in size, in direct proportion, in fact, to every bite you had taken. This macabre realization that the Wendigo spirit had driven you to kill your loved ones to sate your hunger, only to simply leave you larger and hungrier than before, is the true crux and horror of the Wendigo's malice. This realization, understandably, would drive most of the Wendigo's victims mad, and with their minds now completely forfeit, the Wendigo spirit would assert full control over its new host. Now, you might expect the Wendigo to continue its hunt, and while this does happen in some tales, interestingly, it's at this point that some ignore their hunger, focusing their effort instead on driving off game, stealing or spoiling stored food sources, and worsening the exact same situations that had driven their current host to accept them. Hopefully, in their eyes, to find a new victim and complete the cycle. All a good bit more horrifying, in my opinion, than the simple forest boogeyman. Now, all of this begs the question, what can one do to prevent such a dismal end? Well, as far as hunting or defending oneself against a Wendigo, nearly every authentic depiction involves the use of fire, with examples ranging from simply burning the creature to as extreme as removing its heart, melting it, and scattering the ashes. The stories I could find tended to agree, though, that the older a Wendigo was, the harder it was to dispose of, and not just due to how much larger it would be. No, there seems to be a trend in these stories of the Wendigo spirit exerting more and more supernatural corruption as it drives its host to consume more prey. This additional corruption would likewise result in the host receiving more and more supernatural power, and ultimately would mean that more extreme measures would need to be taken if the Anishinaabe were to have any hope of stopping it. Indeed, where most accounts agree that a Wendigo in its early stages could be dealt with using a simple arrow, axe, or bullet, often dealing fatal damage to the heart itself, the largest of Wendigos, titanic skeletal beings that would tower over the trees themselves, could only be felled through the combined efforts of multiple groups and tribes. One story I actually remember being told as a child from a picture book by an Algonquin author described just such an encounter and the efforts that were required to fell such a creature. It involved all the tribes in the region meeting together and devising a plan to destroy a Wendigo that had grown so tall that it could step over trees. Warring bands even came together and made peace in face of such a significant threat. They then dug a pit so deep they couldn't drop a stone into it and hear it hit the bottom, and so wide that their strongest warriors couldn't throw a stone across it. They then filled the bottom of the pit with logs, tar, and pitch, and covered the top with felled trees along with sticks and leaves. They then came together for a night of singing and dancing, knowing the noise of the feast would draw the Wendigo in. When it did, and the monstrosity came, the people ran to the other side of the pit, and, as it followed, its enormous weight crushed the trees and it fell into their trap in the ground. The people rushed forward, throwing more logs and torches and vessels of tar and pitch into the pit, setting the Wendigo alight. Then the people worked together for 3 days, continuously throwing in more logs and tar. Men chopped trees in shifts, women collected vessels of pitch and tar, and children ran through the forest gathering small sticks, all to be hurled down into the pit below. Finally, after 3 days without sleep, the people heard a furious shriek, followed by a loud explosion as logs and flames came flying out of the pit. They knew then that the Wendigo's heart must have finally been thawed and destroyed by their fire. To be sure, though, they sent their warriors down into the pit and retrieved the shattered pieces of the Wendigo's heart, shards described as being hard as stone and smooth as glass. They then destroyed each piece in a separate bonfire, each village then taking their share of the ashes to their own lands to dispose of, all to ensure the creature could never regenerate. Such is the colossal, combined effort required to destroy such a creature. All in all, it's quite clear that, whether believed literal beings or not, the Wendigo is a cautionary tale against the dangers of indulging in greed, gluttony, or cannibalism. Similarly, it highlights the crucial importance of community bonds and the unification of the Anishinaabe peoples as the only true way to stop a Wendigo, or what it represents. This cooperation also serves as a poignant allegory, not only to surviving the brutal winters of the North, but the evils that manifest themselves when we succumb to our most primal urges. Now, I'd be remiss to tell you about the Wendigo and not talk to you briefly about the psychological condition of Wendigo psychosis. I also think this point will help tie everything together neatly with Carl, the Swiss Alps, and most importantly, Private Reginald. Wendigo psychosis is considered a psychocultural condition in which extreme hardship, cold temperatures, and low exposure to natural light result in the intense craving for human flesh. A psychocultural or culture-bound syndrome is a mental illness that exclusively impacts people of an extremely specific society or, well, culture. This diagnosis is often thrown around in tabloids and clickbait articles as scientific proof that Wendigos exist, but in reality it's much more straightforward. This is really just an acknowledgement that culture can influence how extreme behaviors will look for a mentally unhealthy individual. In the case of the Anishinaabe peoples, the cultural traditions of the Wendigo and cultural taboos around cannibalism may shape the way someone suffering from psychosis sees the world around them. Another example of this type of condition would be clinical lycanthropy, in which the patient believes they can turn into a wolf and may even act aggressively when in such a state. This condition, like Wendigo psychosis, is also extremely rare, and in both instances, virtually every single case that has ever been documented has been with someone who had the appropriate cryptid as part of their culture. Simply put, people who already have the idea of a werewolf might think such a transformation is possible when mentally unwell. Likewise, those who are raised with the stories of the Wendigo may also have these stories influence them when they are in an unhealthy mental state. The real common denominator here is that we're all human. The human mind naturally tries to make sense of the world around us. To do this, it draws on things it knows, and in the case of mental illness, this can mean the mind is less capable of discerning facts from fiction. And since influences like myths, legends, and parables vary from culture to culture, the ways in which the brain misappropriates fiction will vary as well. So, no, Wendigo psychosis is not scientific proof of the Wendigo. It's the same pattern we see in the same scenarios all around the world. When we look at the big picture, this pattern of psychosis growing from each individual's cultural framework, well, it's really comforting for a number of reasons. All of this, everything I've just said, it's cold, rational, clinical even. It's borderline boring and easy to tune out, and so if you did, don't feel bad. We obviously don't have evidence for people transforming into an enormous skeletal giant, growing in proportion to each victim it consumes. We do, though, have plenty of evidence of humans across the globe losing their grip on reality and fusing it with stories or beings of legend. We have nightmares about things we're familiar with because we're familiar with them. It's similarly comforting to consider how rare these things are. Every known case of Wendigo psychosis has occurred within the Anishinaabe people groups, and the total number of cases are measured in the 1s and 2s per year. And honestly, part of me wanted to leave the topic there, finish the drive, and call all of this a good story. But for all of the things I can draw comfort from with this topic, I can't help but shake the feeling that if I were to leave it at that, I would be lying to you somehow. In reality, this case has actually left me with a lot of uncomfortable questions, and it only gets worse the more I think about it. This case is disturbing to me because it challenges all of those comfortable thoughts I just listed off, all of those boring things you may have tuned out. First off, I just can't bring myself to write this off as a case of Wendigo psychosis. If it were, then Private Reginald would need to be a member of the Anishinaabe peoples. Given how much we already need to assume for this story to be true, not only do I feel this is the biggest leap we'd have to make, it's the most unsubstantiated as well. And that's almost just the tip of the iceberg here. You see, if this story is true and Private Reginald was just your average British commando, well, he still demonstrates a textbook depiction of the historical Wendigo. And he wasn't on a shinabe. So I'm left asking myself, what if the phenomenon of Wendigo psychosis is actually something much, much deeper than a rare but observable psychological disorder tied to the peoples of the Great Lakes region? What if, rather than a unique fusion of poor mental health and cultural factors, the tales and myths of the Wendigo allude to something far beyond just culture and are linked to the human brain itself? Something perhaps anyone, regardless of ancestry or cultural upbringing, might be susceptible to. And if anyone is susceptible to it, that would mean this myth is not rooted in culture, but in human nature and biology. And looking at it under that light, the thing that stands out to me isn't the generic warnings the Wendigo teaches about cannibalism or breaking cultural taboo. No, what stands out to me is the huge emphasis these stories place on the degradation of the human mind before any mention of cannibalism whatsoever. The Wendigo is a tale of how minor indulgence in greed and gluttony can quickly spiral into a horror the entire community must band together to withstand, and it culminates in cannibalism. But it doesn't start there. So, are we missing the point? In this case, I can't help feel that for all of our focus on the end result of cannibalism, we're missing the central warning of the story. The pattern where seemingly normal people, often in the context of hunger, but sometimes solely in the context of fear, will betray friends, family, and tribe without warning. And given that context, I'm left asking, at what point is the moral of the story no longer don't engage in cannibalism, and instead it's, hey, I need to warn you about this thing that we've seen happen where people you may love and trust with your life become something completely different. They will turn on you, they will attack you, they will hunt you, they will kill you, and then they will eat you. We don't know why this happens, we just know it could happen to anyone. And when it does happen, they aren't your friend or your brother or your lover anymore. It's a Wendigo. I know we hear a lot of stories about friends or family being supernaturally transformed into something, and even harming those closest to them. Possession itself is a borderline trope in Western pop culture as a cheap excuse for an unoriginal movie thrill. So it's easy to gloss over this as a similar cheap thrill. But remember the alien? But I really want you to think about this case, this pattern for a moment. Think about someone close to you. Maybe it's your mom or dad or a childhood friend or sibling. Someone you've potentially known your entire life. Someone you likely trust with your life. You've hunted together, you fished together, you're far from home fighting or perhaps fleeing a war together. But you have each other and you depend on that. Do you have them in your mind yet? Does it sound familiar yet? You've got a remote village, a brutal winter, scarce resources, extreme isolation, and the horrific realities of war all clawing at your psyche. But you're strong as long as you have them with you. And they're strong as long as they have you. You'll get through this together as you always have and always will. And then, without warning, they're gone. You can still hear their screams as they're dragged off into the forest by some creature. And it's taken someone else too. But they're not the first, nor will they be the last. They start slowly at first, a child here, a grandparent there, but they will continue. Oh, will they continue, one after another, just as they dragged the one you loved most screaming into the night. Is it familiar now? It's been weeks, months now. You can't even remember when you last slept. And the last few of you remaining, scant and haggard as you might be, are in a fever pitch of terror and anxiety and despondence as you try and put an end to the madness that has become your reality. And you're alone. And you almost catch yourself wondering if it's even worth it anymore. And it just won't stop. Then you see them. After countless weeks of worry, your friend, your sister, your partner, whoever they are, they're back. Running to them in shock and relief, they turn to you and you can see the dark stain of blood running down their mouth and neck, a chunk of their most recent victim glistening between their teeth, while the rest lies at their feet. You hear shouting, screaming, begging. You see people running. No, fighting. You don't even know if the screams are coming from you or the melee taking place around you or the despondent mother who has collapsed to her knees and is cradling the scarlet limp form of a child in her arms. You're staggering forward, trying to get to them, to talk to them. This can't be real. This can't be happening. And with the piercing clap of gunfire or the resonant twang of a bowstring, it's over. The horror of countless nights and frost-numbed days ends with the one you trusted most lying on the ground with a hole through their heart, adorned in a charnel funerary shroud of viscera and scarlet frost. And you have nothing but questions to show for it. Wouldn't you want to know what happened to them, how it happened, how you might stop it from happening to you? Now imagine you hear the same thing happened in the village the next valley over. And then it happens again in the village down the river. What I just had you imagine was not the story of Private Reginald. It was any one of 100 stories about the Wendigo as told by the peoples who first documented this thing. But if you thought it was familiar, if you thought it was simply me trying to put you in the shoes of someone in Private Reginald's story, well, then I think we're finally on the same page and ready to finish our talk about why this story scares me. This case is disturbing to me, not necessarily because I think it's true, though I must admit it's much more plausible than I thought it would be when I began researching. And, honestly, I can't in good conscience say that it's false. No, this story, though, is disturbing to me because of what it might imply if it is true. We live in a world where humanity has survived by watching and learning and identifying the things that go bump in the night. Since our ancestors first climbed down from the trees, our rationality has been the single tool we've had to protect ourselves. Our ancestors used this rationality and mastered fire, so we could banish the shadows and fend off the things that stalk us in the darkness, from the leopards, the eagles, the snakes, the wolves, everything that's preyed upon us. And every stride forward we've made since has been a hallmark Not of our claws or of our fangs or scales or venom, but of our minds. Compound this with the fact that we seem to have very little difficulty accepting or processing unpleasant truths about ourselves, at least on a general scale. War, murder, and desperation have always been nigh unto endemic parts of the human experience, and I doubt anyone out there would argue otherwise. And we, with 500,000 years of evolution driving us to observe and consider and plan and talk about these darkest of things, we don't even have a word for what this thing is. We have words for the end results, sure, but make no mistake, cannibalism, violence, death, even the Wendigo itself, they're all just words to describe what happens at the end of this story. But we don't have a word for whatever it is that's driven thousands upon thousands of the Anishinaabe throughout history, and allegedly Private Reginald in 1943, to just snap. I guess what I'm really getting at is, the more I think about this case, the more uncomfortable it makes me. When I started, I figured this would be a good, albeit likely fictional way to introduce a topic that's very misunderstood. I then got, excited when I started to piece together that the story might be true. But now, if the story is true, hell, if it's even possible, it forces me to ask, what could possibly be so dark, so dangerous inside of us, that we would essentially abandon 500,000 years of evolution, compelling us to learn about and identify danger? What knowledge could be so corrupting that we would take a known real danger, a predator in the night, and disguise it as nothing more than myth? What could make us embrace the insanity of not even giving a word to describe the darkness in which this monster lives, and instead simply rely on our descriptions of the aftermath it leaves in its wake? So, what is it then? If this story is true, if the stories of the Wendigo are based on truth, why are we finding a textbook example of what science calls a culture-bound phenomenon taking place somewhere as far away as the Swiss Alps? Is there some unholy confluence of cold and snow and long nights, maybe with fear or hunger, some cabin fever from hell that would drive any of us, regardless of our ancestry or cultural upbringing, not simply to cannibalism, but to the seemingly complete psychological freefall as our minds as we know them are stripped of either rationality or empathy, and are then replaced as the genetic memory of ancestors long since past crawls forward from the darkness and leaves nothing but a feral, animalistic husk where we once stood. If so, if something about our environment itself, the very world we live in, might trigger some rapid, primal de-evolution of our psyche, what other set of conditions or environmental factors might possibly call forth the shadows lurking within us? What could unleash shadows so dark, so cold, so voracious, that once you're consumed, history doesn't remember you as a murderer or serial killer, but as something that's not even human? How could we possibly answer that? The only way to verify any of this would be to test out every imaginable combination of temperature, of humidity, of blood type, of mental state, diet. I mean, the list of potential factors involved in a transformation like this has to be endless. And the kicker is, If by some unholy miracle you ever were successful in finding that umbral recipe, you would instantly transform into something you wouldn't even recognize. I can't help be confronted with the fact that our very survival, our very existence as a species, has been all but reliant on our ability to look into the darkness, see the things which lurk there, and devise a way to protect ourselves from them. And yet, in this instance, we have a myth that appears to be tied to something far darker than the normal things which haunt us. What might it mean if there is something in the darkness so vile, so dangerous, that our attempts to understand it will do nothing but feed it? Is there some Achillean heel to our intellectual conquest of the natural world, a design flaw in our need to understand something to survive it? Can we stumble into corners of the world so dark that gazing upon the Medusaean things that lurk there would strip us of our sight forever? Do you risk illuminating the darkness, knowing your transformation will be total and instant should you find this Medusa in the dark? Or do you stagger forward blindly, hoping and praying she doesn't find you as you seek the sunlight that abandoned you? If this story is true, it forces me to wonder, how do you possibly protect yourself from the nameless things that lurk in the darkness, when the act of illuminating the darkness itself may just drive you into an abject insanity? And maybe that's the answer to my question. Maybe the reason we know so little about what leads up to the creation of a Wendigo is something as simple, yet all-important as our sanity itself. Maybe those 500,000 years of evolution compelling us to survive our world by understanding it cripples us in the face of a danger that is fundamentally incomprehensible. The Wendigo, as I said, it's not a story about simple cannibalism, greed, or hunger. There is another very real danger, and yet we know next to nothing about it. And that's just the thing. The peoples of the Great White North certainly aren't the only ones throughout history to have experienced starvation, but they are perhaps the first to suggest that there is another very real danger that lurks inside each one of us. One that, once released, might drive us to do things that we would otherwise find unspeakable. Perhaps our ancestors recognized this and, faced with the prospect that some godforsaken conflux of environmental and personal factors might strip us of our thoughts, our memories, our very sentience, well, maybe they realized the only option they had left was to describe this phenomenon in the context of myth, couching it in the cultural safeguards and values the creature it birthed would antithesis. In light of the threats that we might face, maybe we've simply decided it's better to pretend there are no monsters in the darkness. It's probably just easier to gaslight ourselves about these shadows than to confront the fact that we're powerless to stop them. But more than anything, perhaps it's just easier to tell ourselves there are no cold, hungry monsters hiding in the darkness than to admit that the cold, hungry darkness has actually been in the monsters all along.